Sometimes a single act of kindness can change the course of a life forever. Cal Miller was a drifting cowboy who owned nothing but his horse and the dust on his boots. He rode past the Double Bar Ranch, expecting nothing more than maybe a day's work. Instead, he was met at the gate by a lawyer with news that would shake him to his core. Years earlier, Cal had stopped to help a struggling rancher pull a calf from the mud during a brutal drought. He'd asked for nothing in return, just tipped his hat and rode on. That rancher was Old Man Hemlock, and he never forgot. When Hemlock passed away with no family to inherit his vast empire, he left everything to the drifter who'd shown him kindness. But can a man with nothing suddenly become the keeper of a 1,000-hectare legacy? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun had barely cleared the eastern ridge when Cal Miller urged his horse, a sturdy bay mare named Juniper, down the long dirt road that wound through the high desert country of western Montana. The year was 1892, and the territory still held on to its wild character, though the railroads and barbed wire were slowly taming what had once been open range. Cal was 43 years old, though the lines around his eyes and the grey threading through his sandy hair might have suggested a man 10 years older. The life of a drifter aged you faster than steady work and a warm bed ever could. He'd been on the move for the better part of 20 years, ever since a combination of bad luck and poor decisions had cost him his small homestead in Wyoming. Back then, he'd been a young man with dreams of building something lasting, but a hard winter and an unforgiving bank had stripped those dreams away like bark from a dead tree. His wife Sarah had left him shortly after, taking their young daughter Emma back east to live with her family. Cal couldn't blame her. A man who couldn't provide wasn't much of a man in those days, or so he'd believed. The shame of it had driven him to the road, and he'd been traveling ever since, picking up work where he could find it, never staying long enough to put down roots. In the pocket of his worn vest, Cal carried the only thing of value he'd managed to keep from those lost years, his father's silver pocket watch. The case was tarnished now, the engraving on the back nearly worn smooth from years of Cal rubbing his thumb over it in moments of reflection. His father, a railroad man who died when Cal was 16, had given it to him with simple advice. "Time is all any of us really have, son. Spend it wisely, and spend it helping others when you can." Cal had tried to live by those words, even when his own circumstances gave him precious little to offer anyone else. Juniper's hooves clopped steadily on the packed earth, and Cal let his mind wander as they rode. He'd spent the previous 3 weeks helping to drive a small herd of cattle north for a rancher named Dalton, and now that job was done, he found himself once again looking for the next opportunity. His saddlebags held everything he owned: a spare shirt, some socks with holes he kept meaning to darn, a tin cup and plate, a small bag of coffee beans, and a bedroll that had seen better days. He had $11.30 in his pocket, along with the watch. It wasn't much to show for 4 decades of living, but it was honest, and that counted for something. The Double Bar Ranch came into view around mid-morning, sprawling across the valley like a kingdom unto itself. Cal had heard of the place everyone in this part of the territory had. It was one of the largest spreads in Montana, covering more than 1,000 hectares of prime grazing land, with water rights to the Clearwater River and timber rights in the foothills beyond. The main house sat on a rise about half a mile from the road, a 2-story structure built of local stone and timber, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Outbuildings dotted the property: barns, bunkhouses, a smithy, corrals, and storage sheds. Smoke rose from several chimneys, signs of life and industry. Cal had never worked at the Double Bar, but he'd heard stories about the man who owned it. Silas Hemlock was something of a legend, a man who'd come west after the Civil War with nothing and built an empire through sheer determination and an uncanny ability to read the land. Folks said he was a fair employer but a hard man, someone who demanded much from his workers but paid them honestly. They also said he was a recluse, rarely seen in town and increasingly withdrawn in recent years. Some attributed it to age, others to a natural cantankerous disposition that had only grown more pronounced with time. As Cal approached the main gate, he noticed a woman standing there, waiting. She was dressed in a proper traveling suit of dark grey wool, far too fine for ranch work, and she held a leather satchel in one hand. She was perhaps in her early 50s, with sharp eyes and an air of professional competence that marked her as someone from town, maybe even from farther east. When she saw Cal approaching, she stepped forward and raised her hand in greeting. Cal reined in Juniper and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the quiet courtesy that years of wandering had taught him to maintain. "Good morning," the woman replied. Her voice was crisp and educated, confirming Cal's suspicion that she wasn't from around here. "Would you be Cal Miller?" The question caught him off guard. He straightened slightly in the saddle, suddenly wary. "I am," he said carefully, "though I can't say I expected anyone to be looking for me." The woman's expression softened slightly, and she extended her hand. "My name is Margaret Whitmore. I'm an attorney from Helena, and I've been searching for you for the past 3 weeks. I'm very glad to have found you at last." Cal dismounted and shook her hand, his mind racing. An attorney looking for him couldn't mean anything good. Had someone filed a claim against him? Had Sarah died and left debts in his name? The possibilities tumbled through his thoughts like stones down a hillside. "Ma'am, I think there might be some mistake," Cal began. But Margaret Whitmore held up her hand gently. "There's no mistake, Mr. Miller. I represent the estate of Silas Hemlock, the owner of this ranch. He passed away 3 nights ago in his sleep. He was 81 years old." She paused, letting the news settle. "His will was quite specific. You're named as his sole beneficiary." Cal stared at her, certain he'd misheard. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but that can't be right. I never even knew the man. I rode past this place once or twice over the years, but I never set foot on the property, never spoke to Mr. Hemlock." Margaret opened her satchel and withdrew a thick envelope. "Mr. Hemlock's will tells a different story, Mr. Miller. According to his own written account, you met him 7 years ago during the drought of 1885. He was trying to free a calf that had become stuck in a dried-up mud pit on the far western edge of his property. You stopped to help him, worked for nearly 2 hours in the blazing sun to dig that calf free, and when it was done, you refused any payment. You told him you were just glad to help and rode on." The memory came back to Cal in a rush, a hot afternoon, an old man struggling alone, a frightened calf bawling in distress. He'd barely thought about it since. It had seemed like the natural thing to do, the kind of thing any decent person would do. He'd been bone-tired and thirsty, but the old man had needed help, and Cal had 2 good hands and a strong back. They'd worked together in near silence, and when the calf was free and stumbling toward its mother, the old man had offered him money. Cal had waved it off, said something about being glad to be of service, and continued on his way. He'd had no idea the old man was Silas Hemlock. He'd just been another rancher in need. "I remember," Cal said quietly. "But ma'am, that was just, it wasn't anything special. Anyone would have done the same." Margaret's smile was knowing and sad. "Perhaps they would have, Mr. Miller. But they didn't. You did. And Mr. Hemlock never forgot it. He had no living family, no children, no close relatives. He was a man who spent his life building this ranch, and he wanted it to go to someone who understood what it meant to help a stranger without expecting anything in return. That's you." Cal felt the world tilting around him. He looked past Margaret at the sprawling ranch, at the house on the hill, at the land stretching away in all directions. This couldn't be real. Men like him didn't inherit empires. They drifted from job to job, lived lean, and died with nothing but their names and maybe a decent reputation among those who'd known them. "There must be someone else," Cal said, almost desperately. "Someone with more claim. Someone who—" "There isn't," Margaret said firmly. "Mr. Hemlock was very clear. The ranch, the livestock, the equipment, the bank accounts, everything goes to you. There are some provisions for the workers, pensions for those who've been here a long time, but the ranch itself is yours. You're now one of the largest landowners in Montana Territory, Mr. Miller." Cal reached into his vest pocket and pulled out his father's watch, an old habit when he needed to ground himself. He opened it, looked at the hands frozen at 3:30. The watch had stopped working years ago, but he'd never had the money to get it fixed, and remembered his father's words about time and helping others. Maybe, he thought distantly, this was what those words had meant all along. Maybe all those years of drifting, of helping where he could, even when he had little to give, had been leading to this moment. He looked up at Margaret Whitmore, this stranger who was telling him his life had just changed forever, and asked the only question that mattered: "What do I do now?" Margaret's smile was warm and genuine. "Now, Mr. Miller, you come with me to the house. We have papers to sign, staff to meet, and a ranch to learn. You're home." The word hung in the air between them, home. Cal hadn't had one of those in 20 years. He tucked the watch back into his pocket, took Juniper's reins, and followed Margaret Whitmore through the gates of the Double Bar Ranch, walking into a future he'd never imagined and wasn't sure he deserved. But as he walked, he felt his father's watch pressing against his chest, like a reminder, like a promise, like a benediction on everything that was about to begin. The house was even more impressive up close. Margaret led Cal through the front door into a wide entryway with polished wooden floors and walls lined with photographs and paintings of the ranch's history. The air smelled of leather, wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of pipe tobacco. A tall grandfather clock stood against one wall, its steady tick-tock marking time in the silence. They entered what Margaret called the study, a large room dominated by a massive oak desk, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and a stone fireplace. Afternoon light streamed through tall windows that looked out over the valley. On the desk lay a stack of papers, and beside them a leather-bound document that Margaret handled with obvious care. "This is Mr. Hemlock's will," she said, opening it carefully. "Before we proceed with the transfer of property, I need you to understand what you're inheriting, Mr. Miller. This isn't just land and livestock. It's responsibility." Cal sat in the chair she indicated, feeling out of place among the fine furnishings. His dusty clothes seemed to leave marks on everything he touched. Margaret sat across from him and began to explain the scope of the Double Bar Ranch. The numbers were staggering. 1,043 hectares of deeded land, with grazing rights to another 2,000 hectares of government range. 1,500 head of cattle, 200 horses, 12 full-time ranch hands, a foreman, a cook, and seasonal workers during roundup and branding. The ranch turned a profit of nearly $20,000 a year, a sum that made Cal's head spin. But as Margaret continued reading, Cal noticed something change in her expression. She paused, her finger tracing a line in the will, and her professional composure cracked just slightly. "Is something wrong?" Cal asked. Margaret looked up, and he saw concern in her eyes. "Mr. Miller, there's a complication I wasn't fully aware of until I reviewed the complete file this morning. Mr. Hemlock's neighbor to the south, a man named Garrett Blackwood, filed a land claim 3 months ago. He's contesting the boundary between the Double Bar and his property, claiming that a survey error in 1878 means that approximately 200 hectares, currently considered part of this ranch, actually belong to him." Cal leaned forward. "Can he do that? After all these years?" "Montana Territory law allows for boundary disputes to be raised if new evidence comes to light," Margaret explained. "Blackwood claims to have found the original survey documents that show the error. If he's right, and if a judge rules in his favor, you'd lose not just the land, but also the water rights associated with it. That section includes the primary access point to the Clearwater River during the dry months. Without it, this ranch's value drops by nearly half." The weight of it settled on Cal's shoulders like a physical burden. He'd gone from owning nothing to owning everything, to potentially losing half of everything in the span of a single morning. What did Mr. Hemlock think about this claim? Margaret's expression darkened. "According to his foreman, a man named Dutch Keller. Mr. Hemlock believed the claim was fraudulent. He'd been preparing to fight it in court, but his health was failing. The hearing is scheduled for 6 weeks from now. If you accept this inheritance, Mr. Miller, you'll be walking into a legal battle that could determine the ranch's survival. Cal stood and walked to the window, looking out over the land that was supposedly his. In the distance, he could see cattle grazing, their dark shapes moving slowly across the golden grass. Ranch hands were working near one of the corrals, their voices carrying faintly on the wind. These were people whose livelihoods depended on this ranch, on the decisions he would make. "Tell me about Blackwood," Cal said quietly. Margaret joined him at the window. "Garrett Blackwood owns the Circle B ranch to the south. It's about half the size of the Double Bar, but it's been struggling. Blackwood is younger than Mr. Hemlock was, maybe 60 years old, and he's ambitious. There have been rumors for years that he wanted to buy the Double Bar, but Mr. Hemlock always refused. Some folks in town think this boundary dispute is really just a way to weaken your position, to force a sale." "My position," Cal repeated, the words still feeling strange. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I'm the right person for this. Maybe it would be better if you walked away." Margaret turned to face him directly. "Mr. Miller, I won't pretend to know why Mr. Hemlock chose you. I only met him twice, both times in my professional capacity. But I've spent enough years dealing with wills and estates to know that a man doesn't leave his life's work to a stranger without good reason. He saw something in you that day 7 years ago, something that made him believe you were the person who should carry this forward." Cal reached into his vest and touched his father's watch through the fabric. The metal was warm from his body heat. He thought about all the years of drifting, of working other men's land, of never having anything to call his own. He thought about Sarah and Emma, about the man he'd been and the man he'd failed to be. Maybe this was a chance to be someone different. Maybe it was a chance to finally build something that would last. "What do I need to do?" he asked. Margaret returned to the desk and began organizing papers. "First, you need to sign the documents accepting the inheritance. Then you need to meet with Dutch Keller, the foreman. He's been running this ranch day to day for the past 5 years, and he knows more about the operation than anyone. You'll also need to hire a surveyor to examine Blackwood's claim and provide testimony for the hearing. And Mr. Miller, you need to be prepared for the possibility that some of the ranch hands might not want to work for you." That last part caught Cal off guard. "Why not?" "Because you're an unknown," Margaret said simply. "They've been loyal to Mr. Hemlock, some of them for decades. You're a drifter who inherited their home because of a single act of kindness. Some will respect that. Others will resent it. You'll need to prove yourself." Cal nodded slowly. It made sense. He'd been a ranch hand himself. He knew how men thought, how they measured each other. Words meant nothing, only actions counted. And even then, you had to prove yourself over and over again until respect became something solid and earned. "All right," he said. "Let's sign the papers." For the next hour, Cal signed his name more times than he had in the previous 10 years combined. Each signature felt like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep, but he signed them anyway. When it was done, Margaret gathered the documents and stood. "Congratulations, Mr. Miller. You're now the legal owner of the Double Bar Ranch. I'll file these papers in Helena and arrange for a surveyor to come out within the week. In the meantime, I suggest you start learning everything you can about this place. Knowledge is going to be your best defense against whatever Garrett Blackwood has planned." She extended her hand, and Cal shook it, feeling the firmness of her grip. "Thank you, ma'am, for everything." "Don't thank me yet," Margaret said with a slight smile. "The hard part is just beginning. But for what it's worth, Mr. Miller, I think Mr. Hemlock chose well. I hope you prove me right." After she left, Cal stood alone in the study, surrounded by the accumulated history of a man he'd barely known. The grandfather clock ticked steadily, marking the passage of time, and Cal pulled out his father's watch again. He opened the case and looked at the frozen hands, remembering that you couldn't turn back time, couldn't undo the past. You could only move forward, making the best choices you could with what you'd been given. He'd been given a ranch and a fight. Now he had to figure out how to win both. Cal found Dutch Keller in the main barn, supervising the shoeing of a pair of draft horses. The foreman was a stocky man in his late 50s, with a weathered face and hands that showed a lifetime of hard work. When one of the ranch hands pointed Cal out, Dutch straightened and walked over, wiping his palms on his canvas pants. "So you're the one," Dutch said. It wasn't a question, and his tone carried no particular warmth or hostility, just a statement of fact. "Cal Miller," Cal said, offering his hand. Dutch shook it, his grip testing. "Dutch Keller. Been foreman here for 5 years. Worked for Mr. Hemlock for near 15 before that. I suppose you'll want to make changes." "I suppose I'll want to learn what we're doing before I make any changes at all," Cal replied evenly. Something shifted in Dutch's expression, a slight relaxation around the eyes. "That's a smart answer. Come with me. I'll show you the books." They walked to the ranch office, a smaller building adjacent to the main barn. Inside, Dutch pulled a leather-bound ledger from a shelf and laid it on a scarred wooden table. The ledger was thick, its pages filled with entries in multiple hands, spanning years. Dutch opened it to the most recent section. "Here's the heart of the operation," Dutch said, running his finger down a column of numbers. "Every head of cattle, every expense, every sale, every birth and death, it's all recorded. Mr. Hemlock was particular about that. He always said, you can't manage what you don't measure." Cal leaned over the ledger, studying the entries. The handwriting was neat and precise, though he noticed that the most recent entries were in a different, shakier script. Was Mr. Hemlock still keeping the books himself? "Up until about 3 months ago," Dutch confirmed. "When his hands got too unsteady, I took over." But he checked every entry, questioned every number. He knew this ranch down to the last horseshoe nail. As Dutch explained the operation, Cal began to understand the scope of what he'd inherited. The Double Bar wasn't just a ranch, it was a complex business with multiple revenue streams, seasonal cycles, and dozens of interconnected dependencies. The spring roundup was coming in 6 weeks, right around the time of the boundary dispute hearing. They'd need every hand working at full capacity, and they'd need to move cattle away from the contested land to avoid any complications with Blackwood's claim. "What do the men think?" Cal asked. "About me inheriting?" Dutch closed the ledger and leaned back against the table, crossing his arms. "They're divided. Some remember the stories Mr. Hemlock used to tell about a drifter who helped him with a stuck calf. He never mentioned your name, but he talked about that day like it meant something. Those men figure if Mr. Hemlock saw fit to leave you the ranch, that's good enough for them. Others think you got lucky with one good deed, and you'll run this place into the ground inside a year. What do you think?" Dutch studied him for a long moment. "I think Mr. Hemlock was the shrewdest judge of character I ever met. He built this place from nothing, survived droughts, hard winters, cattle thieves, and every other misfortune the territory could throw at him. If he trusted you with his legacy, I'm willing to give you a chance to prove you're worth that trust. But I won't lie to you, Miller, you're going to have to earn your place here. These men don't care about legal papers. They care about whether you can lead them through a tough season and keep this ranch running." "Fair enough," Cal said. "Then I reckon I should start by learning everything I can and working as hard as everyone else." "You planning to work alongside the hands?" "I've been a ranch hand most of my life," Cal said. "I know how to rope, brand, mend fence, and break horses. I may own this place now, but I don't plan to sit in the big house while other men do the real work." Dutch nodded slowly, and Cal thought he saw the beginning of respect in the older man's eyes. "All right then. We've got a section of fence down on the North Range. Storm took it out 2 nights ago. I was going to send a crew out tomorrow to fix it. You can ride with them. I'll be ready at first light." "Dawn comes early here," Dutch warned. "I'm used to early," Cal replied. That evening, Cal moved his few possessions into the main house. The ranch cook, a gruff man named Tobias who'd been with Hemlock for over a decade, showed him to what had been the owner's bedroom on the second floor. It was a large room with a four-poster bed, a wardrobe, a writing desk, and windows that overlooked the valley. Cal set his saddlebags on a chair and stood in the middle of the room, feeling like an intruder. "Mr. Hemlock slept here for 30 years, Tobias said from the doorway. "Died right there in that bed, peaceful as a man could hope. He was a good man to work for, fair and honest. Hope you'll be the same." After Tobias left, Cal unpacked his meager belongings. The wardrobe was still full of Hemlock's clothes, and Cal realized he'd need to deal with those soon, though the thought of going through a dead man's possessions felt invasive. He placed his father's watch on the nightstand and sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress much softer than anything he'd slept on in years. Through the window, he could see the last light fading from the sky, stars beginning to emerge in the deepening blue. Somewhere out there, Garrett Blackwood was planning his next move, preparing to take a piece of this ranch through legal maneuvering. And out there, too, were the men Cal would need to convince that he deserved to lead them, that he was more than just a lucky drifter. He thought about Margaret Whitmore's words that Hemlock had seen something in him worth trusting. But what had the old rancher seen? A moment of simple decency, the kind of thing any halfway good person would do. Was that really enough to justify all of this? Or was there something more, something Cal couldn't yet see in himself? His father's watch caught the moonlight on the nightstand, and Cal remembered another piece of advice the old railroad man had given him. "When you don't know what to do, son, do the next right thing in front of you. Then do the next one after that. Pretty soon, you'll have built something worthwhile." Tomorrow he'd ride out to fix fence with the ranch hands. It was the next right thing to do. After that, he'd figure out the thing after that. One day at a time, one choice at a time, until either he proved himself worthy of this impossible gift, or he proved he wasn't. Either way, he'd know he'd given it everything he had. Cal pulled off his boots and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling around him. Sleep was a long time coming. Dawn came cold and clear, with frost on the grass and Cal's breath misting in the air as he walked to the barn. He found 3 ranch hands already there, saddling horses and loading supplies onto a pack mule. They looked up when he approached, and Cal saw the questions in their eyes, the sizing up that working men always did with a new boss. "Morning," Cal said simply, and went to saddle Juniper. One of the men, a young fellow who couldn't have been more than 25, stepped forward. "Name's Riley Tate, Mr. Miller. This here's Porter and Jackson. We're the fence crew Dutch assigned." "Call me Cal," he said, cinching the saddle tight, "and I appreciate you letting me ride along. I need to learn this land." Riley seemed surprised by that, but Porter, an older man with a graying beard, just nodded. "Land's good teacher if you listen to it," he said. They rode out as the sun was breaking over the mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. The North Range was about an hour's ride from the main compound, and as they traveled, Porter pointed out landmarks and explained the layout of the property. Cal listened carefully, committing it all to memory: the location of springs and water sources, the natural corrals formed by rock outcroppings, the paths that cattle preferred when moving between grazing areas. The damaged fence was worse than Cal had expected. A section nearly 50 yards long had been knocked down, and several of the posts were broken clean through at ground level. The men dismounted and began assessing the work needed. "Storm must have hit hard," Riley said, examining one of the broken posts, but Porter was frowning, turning a piece of splintered wood over in his hands. "Look at this," he said, showing it to Cal. The break wasn't the jagged split you'd expect from wind damage. It was too clean, too straight, like someone had partially cut through the post before letting the storm finish the job. "Could have been lightning," Jackson offered, but he didn't sound convinced. "Could have been," Porter agreed, but I've seen lightning strikes, and they don't leave marks like this. Looks more like saw marks to me." Cal knelt and examined the post more closely. Porter was right, there were definite tool marks in the wood, shallow grooves that had weakened the post enough that a strong wind would snap it. Someone had sabotaged this fence, made it look like storm damage. "This section borders Blackwood's range, doesn't it?" Cal asked quietly. Porter nodded. "His fence line is about 200 yards that way, close enough that if our cattle drifted onto his land, he could claim we were trespassing." The implications settled over them. If Blackwood was trying to strengthen his legal claim by manufacturing evidence of poor ranch management or boundary violations, sabotaged fences would serve his purpose well. But proving it would be another matter entirely. "We fix the fence," Cal said, standing. "We fix it properly, with good posts set deep, and we don't talk about what we found here, not to anyone outside this group. Understood?" The three men nodded, and Cal saw a shift in their expressions. This wasn't just theoretical ranch management anymore. This was a problem that needed solving, and Cal was handling it the way a rancher should: practical, direct, and with an eye toward protecting the rancher's interests. They worked through the morning, digging out the damaged posts and setting new ones. Cal worked alongside them, his hands remembering the rhythm of ranch work, the particular ache in the shoulders from swinging a post-hole digger, the satisfaction of seeing a fence line go up straight and true. The men worked efficiently, and gradually the conversation loosened. Riley talked about his family's small homestead to the east. Jackson mentioned a wife and 3 children. Porter told a story about working a cattle drive through a blizzard in '84 that had Cal and the others laughing despite the cold. By noon, they'd replaced all the damaged posts and were stringing new wire. Cal was tightening a strand when Riley spoke up from behind him. "Mr. Mill Cal, I mean. Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Is it true you met Mr. Hemlock just once, that day with the calf?" Cal pulled the wire tight and secured it before answering. "It's true. I didn't know who he was, didn't know this ranch existed. I was just passing through, saw a man who needed help, and stopped to give it." "And he left you everything because of that?" Cal turned to face the young man. "He left me everything because of that," he confirmed. "I know how strange it sounds. I know some folks think I don't deserve it. Truth is, I'm not sure I do deserve it, but Mr. Hemlock made his choice, and now it's my responsibility to honor that choice by taking care of this land and the people who depend on it. That's what I aim to do." Porter had stopped working and was listening. "Dutch said you've been a drifter for 20 years. What made you help that day? Most drifters wouldn't have stopped." Cal thought about it, about that hot afternoon and the decision that had seemed so simple at the time. "My father used to tell me that the measure of a man isn't what he does when people are watching. It's what he does when nobody's looking and he's got nothing to gain. That old rancher needed help, and I had 2 hands and a strong back. Seemed like the right thing to do." Jackson spoke up for the first time all morning, his voice gruff but not unkind. "You work hard for a rich man." "I'm a rancher now," Cal said. "Rich or poor doesn't change the work that needs doing." They finished the fence by mid-afternoon and rode back to the ranch as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks. Dutch was waiting in the yard, and Cal dismounted and walked over to report. He told the foreman about the fence repair but didn't mention the suspicious damage. Not yet. He wanted to think about it first, figure out the right way to handle what might be the opening move in a larger game. That evening, Tobias served dinner in the main house, but Cal asked if he could eat in the bunkhouse with the men instead. Dutch raised an eyebrow at that, but nodded his approval. So Cal carried his plate to the long wooden table where the ranch hands gathered for their evening meal, and he sat down among them, just another working man at the end of a long day. The conversation was careful at first, the men still feeling out this stranger who owned their livelihood. But gradually, as the meal went on and stories were shared, Cal felt the first small threads of connection beginning to form. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was a start. And starts were all any man could hope for when building something new. The surveyor arrived 4 days later, a meticulous man named Edmund Frost, who came from Helena with cases of equipment and an assistant who recorded everything in careful detail. Cal spent 2 days riding the disputed boundary with him, watching as Frost set up his instruments, took measurements, and consulted maps that showed the evolution of the property lines over decades. The original survey from 1878 was hand-drawn on yellowed paper, the lines and notations faded but still legible. Frost spread it out on a flat rock and weighted the corners with stones while he compared it to more recent surveys and his own measurements. "The problem," Frost explained, adjusting his spectacles, "is that the 1878 survey used natural landmarks that no longer exist. See here, it references the lightning-struck pine on the ridge. That tree fell years ago. The boundary was supposed to run from that tree to the spring in the red rocks, but there are 3 springs in rock formations that could be described as red. Depending on which spring the original surveyor meant, the boundary line shifts by as much as 200 hectares. Cal studied the map, trying to understand the implications. He's claiming that the original surveyor meant the northernmost spring, which would put a significant portion of your current grazing land on his side of the line. He's produced a document allegedly from the surveyor's personal notes that supports his interpretation. You say allegedly. You don't believe the document is genuine? Frost carefully rolled up the old map. I'm not in a position to authenticate historical documents, Mr. Miller. That's not my expertise. What I can tell you is that the surveyor who did the original work, a man named Callahan, had a reputation for thorough record-keeping. It seems odd that such an important detail would have been left ambiguous if he was as careful as people say. But proving the document is fraudulent would require handwriting analysis, verification of paper and ink age, things beyond my scope. They rode back to the ranch in thoughtful silence. Cal knew what it meant. The legal battle would come down to interpretation, expert testimony, and ultimately the judgment of a territorial judge who might or might not understand the nuances of survey work and property law. The uncertainty gnawed at him. He'd been a rancher for less than 2 weeks, and already the thing he'd inherited felt like it was slipping through his fingers. That evening, Margaret Whitmore returned from Helena with news. Cal met her in the study, and the expression on her face told him it wasn't good news. "Blackwood has hired additional counsel," she said without preamble, "Thomas Wickham from Denver. He's known for winning land disputes through aggressive litigation. They're also bringing in their own surveyor to dispute Mr. Frost's findings. Can they do that? They can submit whatever expert testimony they want. The judge will decide which evidence to credit." Margaret sat down heavily, fatigue evident in her posture. "Mr. Miller, I need to be frank with you. Blackwood is well connected in this territory. He's been here 30 years, served on the territorial council, has friends in high places. You're an unknown outsider who inherited a fortune through what some people see as an eccentric old man's whim. In a fair fight, I believe we'd win, but this may not be a fair fight." Cal walked to the window, looking out over the darkening valley. Lights were beginning to appear in the bunkhouse and the other buildings, small points of warmth against the gathering night. "What do you recommend?" "Fight," Margaret said simply, "but be prepared for the possibility that we might lose, and have a plan for what comes after." What would come after? Blackwood would likely offer to buy the remainder of the ranch at a reduced price. With the water rights gone, your operation would be severely compromised. You'd face the choice of struggling on diminished terms or selling and taking whatever you could get. "Which is probably what he's wanted all along," Cal said quietly. "Very likely." Cal thought about the men in the bunkhouse, about Dutch and his careful ledgers, about Riley and Porter and Jackson fixing fence in the cold dawn. He thought about Silas Hemlock, an old man who'd built something lasting and trusted him to protect it. And he thought about his father's watch, still sitting on the nightstand upstairs, a reminder that time was all any of us really had. "Then we fight," Cal said, And we fight smart. If Blackwood's willing to sabotage fences and manufacture evidence, he's not going to stop there. We need to be vigilant, document everything, and make sure we're not caught off guard." Margaret nodded, approval evident in her expression. "I'll continue gathering evidence and preparing our case. Mr. Frost will submit his report. In the meantime, keep your eyes open. If Blackwood makes another move, we need to know about it immediately." After Margaret left, Cal went to find Dutch. The foreman was in his quarters, a small house near the main barn where he lived alone. Cal told him about the surveyor's findings and Blackwood's escalating legal tactics. "So what do you need from me?" Dutch asked when Cal finished. "I need you to organize a night watch on the disputed boundary. Rotate the men, keep it quiet, but I want eyes on that land every night until this is settled. If Blackwood's people are moving cattle onto our range or causing more damage, I want to know about it, and I want proof we can take to a judge." Dutch considered this, then nodded slowly. "I can do that, though the men won't appreciate the extra work, especially with Roundup coming." "I'll work the watch rotation myself," Cal said. "One night in 4. That should help." "You don't have to do that. You're the owner." "I'm a rancher," Cal corrected, "and ranchers do whatever needs doing to protect their land." Dutch smiled for the first time since Cal had met him. "Mr. Hemlock used to say something similar. Maybe he knew what he was doing after all." That night, Cal took the first watch himself, riding out to the disputed boundary as the moon rose over the mountains. He found a spot with good visibility and settled in to wait, Juniper standing patiently beside him. The night was cold and clear, and Cal pulled his coat tighter, his breath misting in the air. Hours passed. Nothing moved except the wind through the grass and the occasional distant cry of a coyote. But Cal didn't mind the watching. It gave him time to think, to plan, to prepare himself for what was coming. Somewhere out there, Garrett Blackwood was making his own plans. And somewhere in the legal papers and survey maps and conflicting testimonies, the truth was waiting to be found. Cal just had to make sure he found it first. 3 weeks into Cal's ownership of the double bar, a letter arrived from Boston. Tobias brought it to him during breakfast, and Cal stared at the unfamiliar handwriting on the envelope with a mixture of curiosity and dread. He hadn't received personal mail in years. He waited until he was alone in the study before opening it. The letter was written on fine paper in a neat, feminine hand. "Dear Father, I hope this letter finds you well. I learned of your changed circumstances through a notice in a legal journal that came across my husband's desk. He is an attorney here in Boston, and he recognized your name from when I told him about my family years ago. I confess I was shocked to learn that you had inherited a ranch in Montana. Mother told me you had nothing, that you had chosen the life of a drifter rather than staying to build a future with us. I do not write to make accusations or reopen old wounds. I write because I am now 34 years old with 3 children of my own, and I find myself thinking about family and legacy and the stories we tell ourselves about our parents. If you are willing, I would like to know your side of the story. I would like my children to know their grandfather, if there is a grandfather worth knowing. Your daughter, Emma." Cal read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling slightly by the third reading. Emma, his little girl, who had been 6 years old when Sarah took her east, was now a woman with children of her own. He had grandchildren he'd never met, a life he'd walked away from because he'd been too ashamed to face his failures as a provider. He sat at the desk and pulled out a piece of paper, then stared at it for a long moment before beginning to write. The words came slowly at first, then faster, as 20 years of silence demanded to be broken. "Dear Emma, I cannot tell you what it meant to receive your letter. I have thought about you every day since you left, wondered what kind of woman you'd become, hoped that your life was better than what I could have given you. You deserve to know the truth about why I let you go. Your mother was right to leave me. I had failed as a husband and as a father. I lost our homestead through a combination of bad luck and poor judgment, and I was too proud to accept help from her family. I told myself I would rebuild, that I would prove I could provide, but the years passed, and all I did was drift from job to job, too ashamed to come back with empty hands. I am not proud of that choice. I should have fought harder. I should have been there for you, regardless of my circumstances, but I wasn't, and I have to live with that. As for the ranch, it came to me through an act of kindness I barely remember doing. An old rancher named Silas Hemlock left me everything when he died, and I'm still trying to figure out why. I think maybe he saw something in me I couldn't see in myself. I hope he was right. If you're willing, I would very much like to meet your children and try to be the grandfather I never was as a father. Your father, Cal. He sealed the letter and gave it to Tobias to post, then went back to the work of running the ranch with Emma's words echoing in his mind. The idea that he might have a chance to be part of his daughter's life again, to know his grandchildren, gave him something he hadn't had before, a reason beyond duty to make this ranch work. It wasn't just about honoring Hemlock's trust anymore. It was about proving to himself and to his daughter that he could be someone worth knowing. The night watches continued, with Cal and 3 rotating teams of ranch hands keeping an eye on the disputed boundary. On Cal's 4th watch, something finally happened. He was positioned on a ridge overlooking the boundary when he saw riders moving along the fence line in the darkness. There were 3 of them, and they were working methodically, cutting wire and pulling down posts in a section they must have thought was far enough from the main ranch to go unnoticed until morning. Cal didn't confront them directly. Instead, he watched carefully, noting their methods and their faces when they passed close enough to a bright moon. Then he rode back to the ranch and woke Dutch and Riley. "Get 2 of the men and come with me," Cal said quietly. "Bring the camera." Silas Hemlock had owned a camera, a relatively new device he'd used to document the ranch's growth. Cal had found it in the study, and now they put it to use. By the time the sun rose, Cal had photographs of the damaged fence, clear images taken in the early morning light that showed the fresh cuts and the tool marks. More importantly, he had witness statements from Dutch and Riley about the riders they'd observed, and he had samples of the cut wire that showed the same clean, deliberate cuts they'd found on the earlier damaged section. Margaret Whitmore was impressed when Cal presented the evidence. "This is excellent work, Mr. Miller. If we can tie these men to Blackwood's operation, it could seriously damage his credibility with the judge." "Can we tie them to him? One of the men you described matches the description of Blackwood's foreman. If we can establish that connection and prove he was acting on Blackwood's orders, yes, we can make that case." The hearing was now just 2 weeks away, and the tension on the ranch was palpable. The spring roundup had to be coordinated around the legal proceedings, and Cal found himself working 18-hour days, learning the nuances of ranch management while simultaneously preparing for a legal battle that could end everything. But through it all, he kept thinking about Emma's letter, about the possibility of redemption. He'd spent 20 years believing he was a man who'd failed at the things that mattered most. Maybe, he thought, he'd been wrong about that. Maybe the measure of a man wasn't just in his failures, but in what he did afterward, in whether he kept trying to do better, even when he'd fallen short. One evening, as Cal was reviewing legal documents in the study, Dutch knocked on the door. "Got a minute?" the foreman asked. "Always." Dutch came in and stood awkwardly for a moment before speaking. "The men want you to know something. Whatever happens at this hearing, whatever Blackwood throws at us, we're standing behind you. You've earned that." Cal felt something tight in his chest, loosen slightly. "I appreciate that, Dutch. More than you know." "You remind us of him," Dutch said. "Mr. Hemlock, I mean. The way you work, the way you treat people. He'd be pleased with how you're handling things." After Dutch left, Cal pulled out his father's watch and opened it, looking at the stopped hands. Time couldn't be turned back, but maybe it didn't need to be. Maybe moving forward was enough. 2 days before the hearing, Cal was going through the desk in the study, organizing papers and looking for any additional documentation that might help their case. He'd learned that Hemlock had been meticulous about record-keeping, and there were files going back decades. In the bottom drawer, pushed to the very back, Cal found a leather journal he hadn't noticed before. The journal was old, the leather soft with age, and when Cal opened it, he recognized Hemlock's handwriting from the ranch ledgers. But these weren't business entries. These were personal reflections, observations, thoughts set down over many years. Cal knew he probably shouldn't read it. These were a dead man's private thoughts, but something made him turn the pages, scanning the entries. Most were mundane observations about the ranch, about the changing seasons, about decisions made and lessons learned. But as Cal reached the entries from the last few years, the tone shifted. Hemlock's writing became more introspective, more concerned with legacy and meaning. And then Cal found an entry dated 3 weeks after that day he'd helped with the stuck calf. "I cannot stop thinking about the young man who stopped to help today." He said his name was Cal Miller, though I only learned that at the end, when I pressed him. He worked for 2 hours in the blazing heat, asking nothing, expecting nothing. When I offered payment, he seemed almost offended, as if helping a stranger was simply what decent people did. I have been building this ranch for 40 years, and in all that time, I have rarely met anyone who acted without calculation, without an eye toward what they might gain. This drifter, who clearly had nothing, gave freely of his time and strength. There was something in his face, in his manner, a fundamental decency that reminded me of someone I once knew. It reminded me of my son. Cal stopped reading, his heart suddenly pounding. Hemlock had a son, but Margaret had said he had no living family, no children. Cal turned the pages carefully, looking for more. The next relevant entry was dated 6 months later. "I have been thinking more about Cal Miller and about my son David. David would have been 40 now, if he had lived. He died at 20, crushed under a loading dock accident in Butte. I was building this ranch, too focused on success, to see that my boy needed guidance, needed his father's attention. By the time I realized what I'd lost, it was too late. I never married, never had other children. This ranch became my substitute for family, but you cannot leave a ranch your regrets. You cannot apologize to land and cattle for the time you failed to spend with the people who mattered. I have been successful in every way that means nothing." Cal's hands were shaking as he continued reading. The entries over the next few years documented Hemlock's growing obsession with finding Cal Miller, with learning what had become of the drifter who'd reminded him so powerfully of his lost son. Hemlock had hired men to search, had followed rumors and trail stories, had spent thousands of dollars trying to locate a nameless cowboy in a vast territory. And then, 2 years ago, there was this entry. "I found him. Cal Miller is working a ranch outside of Billings. I watched him from a distance today, saw him working with the horses. He moves with the same quiet competence David had, the same steady presence. I have revised my will to name him as my heir. When I die, everything will go to him, not because he earned it through that one act of kindness, though that mattered, but because he deserves a chance that my son never got. David died working someone else's dream. Cal Miller has spent 20 years the same way. If I can give him the opportunity to build something of his own, to have a legacy, then perhaps that will balance some small measure of what I failed to give my son. I will not tell him. He must come to this without obligation, without the weight of knowing why. He must choose to honor this gift on his own terms, and in doing so, perhaps redeem us both." Cal set the journal down and walked to the window, his vision blurred. He'd thought Hemlock left him the ranch because of simple kindness, because of one afternoon's work, but it was so much more than that. Hemlock had seen in Cal a second chance, a way to give the opportunity to someone that he'd failed to give his own son. The ranch wasn't a reward. It was a father's grief, trying to find meaning, trying to transform regret into something purposeful. Cal understood now why Hemlock had been so specific in his will, why he'd left detailed instructions but no explanation. The old rancher had wanted Cal to earn this place on his own merits, to become worthy of it through his own choices, rather than through some obligation to a dead man's guilt. It was a test and a gift and an act of faith, all woven together. He thought about his own daughter Emma, about the years he'd lost with her, about the regrets he carried. Hemlock had lost his son to death. Cal had lost his daughter to his own shame and failure. Both men carried the weight of fatherhood done poorly, of chances missed and time squandered. But Hemlock had found a way to transform his grief into something constructive, to take his regret and shape it into opportunity for someone else. Cal picked up the journal again and found the final entry, written just a week before Hemlock's death. "I am dying. The doctor confirms what I have known in my bones for months. Soon Cal Miller will learn that he has inherited everything I built. I wonder what he will make of it. I wonder if he will understand that this gift comes with a burden, the burden of doing better than I did, of building something that matters not just in acres and dollars, but in the lives it touches. I will not live to see whether he succeeds or fails. I can only hope that I have chosen well, that my judgment of his character was sound. If he reads this journal someday, I want him to know, you reminded me of my son, but you are not my son. You are your own man. Whatever you make of this ranch, make it yours. Do not carry my regrets. Carry your own dreams. That is the only inheritance that matters." Cal closed the journal and held it against his chest. The hearing was in 2 days. Blackwood was trying to take a piece of this ranch through legal maneuvering and outright sabotage. Cal had spent the past month learning to be a rancher, learning to lead men, learning to fight for something bigger than himself. But now he understood what he was really fighting for. He was fighting for the chance Hemlock had given him, yes, but also for the chance Hemlock never got to give his son. He was fighting for every father who'd failed and wished for redemption, for every man who'd drifted too long and needed a place to stand. And he was fighting for himself, for the man he could still become if he was brave enough to try. Dutch knocked on the study door and entered, seeing Cal standing with the journal. "You all right?" "I just learned something important," Cal said, "about why Hemlock chose me, about what this ranch really means." "Does it change anything?" Cal thought about that. "No," he said finally. "It makes everything clearer. We're not just defending property in that courtroom. We're defending the idea that people deserve second chances, that past failures don't have to define the future. That's worth fighting for." Dutch nodded slowly. "Then, let's make damn sure we win." That night, Cal wrote another letter to Emma, telling her about Hemlock and his journal, about loss and redemption, and the strange ways that grace can find us when we least expect it. He told her that he finally understood what his father had meant about spending time wisely and helping others. "Sometimes," he wrote, "the help you give comes back to you in ways you could never imagine, and sometimes the measure of your life isn't in what you've lost, but in what you do with what you're given afterward." He sealed the letter and placed it next to his father's watch, 2 connections to different fathers and different lessons, but both pointing toward the same truth. What mattered wasn't whether you failed, but whether you kept trying to do better. The morning before the hearing, Edmund Frost arrived at the ranch with urgent news. Cal met him in the yard, where the surveyor was pulling equipment from his wagon with barely contained excitement. "I found something," Frost said without preamble. "I've been going over the historical records, comparing different surveys, and I realized that the original surveyor, Callahan, was known for a particular practice. He would set brass markers at key boundary points, small stakes driven into the ground with his initials and the year stamped on them. If we can find even one of those original markers, it would definitively establish which spring was meant to be the boundary reference." Cal felt hope surge. Where would these markers be? Based on the survey notes and my calculations, there should be one approximately 50 yards due east of what I believe is the correct spring. The problem is, we're talking about markers set 47 years ago. They could be buried, overgrown, or long since removed. Then we dig, Cal said simply. Within an hour, Cal had assembled a crew: Dutch, Riley, Porter, Jackson, and 3 others. Frost led them to the disputed area, to the spring he believed was the correct boundary reference. They spread out in a grid pattern, probing the ground with steel rods, looking for anything that might be buried beneath decades of soil and grass. The work was slow and frustrating. The spring was in a rocky area where the ground was hard and riddled with stones that made false signals. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, beating down on them as they worked. Some of the men began to lose hope, muttering that they were wasting time they should be spending on roundup preparation. But Cal kept working, methodically probing each section of ground. He thought about Hemlock and David, about fathers and sons, and the chances we get to make things right. He thought about Emma and her children, about the grandfather he wanted to be, and he thought about all the years he'd spent drifting, never building anything, never fighting for anything. This was his chance to be different, to be better, to prove that Hemlock's faith hadn't been misplaced. His steel rod hit something solid that didn't feel like rock. He dropped to his knees and began digging with his hands, pulling away dirt and grass roots. Dutch saw him and came over, and together they excavated around whatever Cal had found. It was brass, tarnished green with age, but unmistakable. As they cleared more dirt, they could see it was a small stake, perhaps 6 inches of it still visible, driven deep into the ground. And on its face, still legible despite the corrosion, were stamped the letters J.C. and the year 1878. "That's it," Frost said, his voice awed. "That's Callahan's marker. This proves the boundary beyond any doubt." Cal sat back on his heels, dirt under his fingernails, sweat running down his face, and felt something like joy. They had evidence. They had proof. Blackwood's claim was based on documents that could be questioned, but this was physical, concrete, irrefutable. "We need to document this immediately," Margaret Whitmore said. She'd ridden out with them, hoping for exactly this kind of breakthrough. Photographs, measurements, sworn statements from everyone present. "Mr. Frost, you'll need to prepare detailed testimony about what this marker represents and how it establishes the boundary." They worked through the afternoon, documenting everything with meticulous care. Cal watched as the evidence accumulated, as the case they'd been building suddenly gained the kind of solid foundation it had been lacking. But he also felt the weight of it settling on his shoulders. Tomorrow he would walk into a courtroom and fight for everything Hemlock had given him, for the ranch and the men who depended on it, for the legacy of a man he'd barely known but had come to deeply respect. That evening, as the sun was setting, Cal took a moment alone on the porch of the main house. He pulled out his father's watch and opened it, looking at the stopped hands. The watch had been broken for so long that he'd forgotten it had ever worked. But maybe that was the point. Time didn't heal wounds. People did, through the choices they made, through the work they put in, through their willingness to keep trying, even when everything seemed frozen and unchangeable. Dutch found him there as darkness was falling. "As ready as I can be," Cal said. "But Dutch, I want you to know something. If this goes badly, if we lose the disputed land and Blackwood makes an offer on the rest, I won't sell. I'll figure out how to make this ranch work, even with half the water rights gone. The men's jobs are safe, regardless of what happens tomorrow." Dutch was quiet for a moment, then said, "Mr. Hemlock would be proud of you. Not just for fighting this, but for how you've been thinking about it. It's not about winning or losing for you. It's about doing right by the people who count on this place." "He left me more than land," Cal said quietly. "He left me a reason to be better than I was." They stood together in the gathering darkness, 2 men on the edge of a fight that would determine the future of everything around them. In the bunkhouse, lamplight glowed warm through the windows. In the corrals, horses moved restlessly, sensing the tension in the air. And out on the disputed boundary, the brass marker they'd found sat in the earth where it had been placed nearly half a century ago, silent testimony to decisions made long before any of them had arrived. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Cal, dressed in his best clothes, which weren't much, just a clean shirt and his least worn pants, and rode into town with Margaret Whitmore and Dutch. The courthouse was a 2-story stone building in the center of Helena, imposing and official. People were already gathering on the steps, townspeople who'd heard about the case and were curious to see how it would play out. Inside, the courtroom was paneled in dark wood, with high windows that let in shafts of morning light. Garrett Blackwood was already there with his attorneys, a group of 3 well-dressed men who exuded confidence and expensive competence. Blackwood himself was a tall man in his 60s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone used to getting his way. When he saw Cal, his expression was dismissive, as if Cal were a minor irritation rather than a serious opponent. Judge Harold Morrison entered, and everyone stood. Morrison was an older man with keen eyes and a reputation for fairness, tempered by impatience with nonsense. He'd been a territorial judge for 15 years, and people said he could spot a lie from across a courtroom. Margaret Whitmore had coached Cal on courtroom procedures, but sitting in that formal space, with the weight of the law pressing down on him, Cal felt the gravity of what was happening. This wasn't a ranch dispute that could be settled with words and handshakes. This was a legal battle that would be decided by rules and procedures he barely understood. Blackwood's lead attorney, Thomas Wickham, opened with a confident presentation of their case. He displayed the disputed survey documents, brought forward his surveyor to testify about boundary ambiguities, and painted a picture of confused property lines that had been incorrectly maintained for decades. He made it sound reasonable, almost inevitable, that the land should be reallocated. Then it was Margaret's turn. She methodically dismantled each of Blackwood's claims, presented Edmund Frost's expert testimony about survey methodology, showed the photographs of sabotaged fences, and built a picture not of innocent boundary confusion, but of deliberate manipulation. The courtroom listened intently, and Cal saw some doubt beginning to creep into the expressions of those who'd arrived, thinking this was a simple land dispute. But the real moment came when Margaret presented the brass marker. Frost testified about Callahan's known practices, about what the marker represented, and about how its location definitively established the correct boundary. Wickham tried to argue that the marker could have been moved or planted, but Frost's testimony about the depth it was buried and the corrosion patterns made such manipulation unlikely. Judge Morrison leaned forward, studying the photographs and documentation. "Mr. Wickham, do you have any evidence that this marker has been tampered with or relocated?" Wickham hesitated, and in that hesitation, Cal saw the case beginning to shift. "Not direct evidence, Your Honor, but we would argue that—" "Evidence, Counselor, not arguments. Do you have evidence?" "No, Your Honor." Morrison looked at Blackwood, and Cal saw something pass between them, a recognition that the fight was over. The judge spent several minutes reviewing the documents one more time, then set them down and removed his spectacles. "I'm prepared to rule," he said, and the courtroom fell absolutely silent. Cal felt his heart hammering in his chest, felt Dutch's steady presence beside him, felt the weight of everything riding on the next words from the judge's mouth. This was it. Everything he'd built over the past 6 weeks, everything Hemlock had hoped for when he wrote that will, all of it came down to this moment in a courtroom in Helena, Montana, with morning light streaming through high windows and justice hanging in the balance. Judge Morrison put his spectacles back on and looked directly at Cal before speaking. "Mr. Miller, you've been the owner of the Double Bar Ranch for approximately 6 weeks. In that time, you've faced challenges that would have broken many men with far more experience. The court recognizes that this case is not simply about 200 hectares of land. It's about the integrity of property rights, the weight of legacy, and whether justice can prevail against calculated manipulation." He turned his attention to Blackwood. "Mr. Blackwood, your claim raised legitimate questions about survey accuracy, and this court takes such questions seriously. However, the evidence presented today, particularly the discovery of the original surveyor's brass marker, resolves those questions definitively." The marker establishes beyond reasonable doubt that the current boundary is correct and has been correct since 1878. Cal felt Dutch's hand grip his shoulder, but he didn't allow himself to feel relief yet, not until the words were spoken clearly. Morrison continued, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Furthermore, the evidence of fence sabotage and the testimony regarding unusual activity along the disputed boundary suggests that this claim may have been motivated by purposes other than simple boundary clarification. While I'm not making findings about criminal conduct that would be a matter for a different proceeding, I am taking such evidence into account when considering the overall credibility of the parties. The judge picked up his gavel, and the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Therefore, it is the ruling of this court that the boundary between the Double Bar Ranch and the Circle B Ranch shall remain as currently established. Based on the survey work of James Callahan in 1878, as confirmed by the brass boundary marker discovered yesterday, Mr. Blackwood's claim is denied in its entirety. The Double Bar Ranch retains all lands, water rights, and resources currently under its title. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the room. Cal felt the tension that had been coiled in his chest for weeks suddenly release. He'd won. The ranch was secure. The men's jobs were safe. Everything Hemlock had built would continue. Blackwood stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger, and conferred briefly with his attorneys before stalking out of the courtroom. His lawyers gathered their papers more slowly, their expensive competence unable to overcome the simple reality of physical evidence and honest testimony. Margaret turned to Cal with a smile that transformed her usually stern professional demeanor. "Congratulations, Mr. Miller. The ranch is truly yours now, free and clear." Cal shook her hand, then Dutch's, feeling the reality of it settling over him. Outside the courtroom, several of the ranch hands who'd come to witness the proceedings gathered around, their faces showing relief and something like pride. Riley clapped him on the shoulder. Porter shook his hand with his characteristic economy of words. "Well done." The ride back to the ranch felt different than the anxious journey into town that morning. The land looked the same, the rolling hills, the distant mountains, the grass moving in the wind, but Cal saw it now with the certainty of secure ownership. This was his land, legally and definitively, and no one could take it from him through manipulation or legal trickery. When they arrived at the Double Bar, the men who'd stayed behind were waiting in the yard. Word had somehow reached them before Cal's party returned the telegraph office, or perhaps someone who'd ridden hard from town and they'd gathered to hear the official confirmation. Cal dismounted and faced them, these men who'd gradually accepted him, who'd worked alongside him and taught him what it meant to run a ranch. "We won," he said simply. "The boundary stands. The ranch is secure." The cheer that went up was genuine and heartfelt. These men had been living under the uncertainty of the legal challenge, wondering if their jobs and homes would survive regardless of the outcome. Now they knew. The Double Bar would continue. Dutch called for a celebration, nothing elaborate, just a good meal and time to acknowledge what they'd accomplished together. As the men dispersed to their various tasks before dinner, Dutch pulled Cal aside. "There's something you should know," the foreman said quietly. "While you were in town, a rider came from the telegraph office. There's a message for you." He handed Cal a folded piece of paper. Cal opened it with hands that were suddenly unsteady. The message was from Emma. "Received your letter. Your honesty means more than you know. The children and I will come west in September. They want to meet their grandfather. We all do. Love, Emma." Cal read it twice, then looked up at Dutch, unable to keep the emotion from his face. "My daughter is coming. In September. She's bringing my grandchildren." Dutch smiled, and it was perhaps the warmest expression Cal had ever seen on the usually stoic foreman's face. "Then you'd better make sure this place looks its best. Can't have your family thinking you've been neglecting things." Cal laughed, and it felt good, felt right. Everything that had seemed impossible 6 weeks ago was suddenly not just possible but real. He had a ranch. He had men who respected him. And he would have his family back, or at least a chance to start building something with them. He walked to the main house as evening was falling, the judge's ruling in one pocket and Emma's telegram in the other, two pieces of paper that together represented everything he'd thought he'd lost forever and had somehow been given back. 3 days after the ruling, Cal was working in the North Range with Riley when they saw a rider approaching. Cal tensed, recognizing the man. It was Garrett Blackwood, riding alone. Riley's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle in his saddle scabbard, but Cal shook his head. "Let's hear what he has to say." Blackwood reined in his horse 20 feet away, and for a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other. Up close, Cal could see that the older rancher looked tired, diminished somehow from the confident figure he'd been in the courtroom. Blackwood dismounted slowly and stood holding his horse's reins. "Miller," he said by way of greeting. "Blackwood, I came to talk, man to man, if you're willing." Cal glanced at Riley, then nodded. "Go ahead and finish checking the fence line. I'll catch up." Riley looked uncertain but obeyed, riding off slowly and glancing back several times. When he was out of earshot, Cal turned his full attention to Blackwood. "I was wrong," Blackwood said without preamble, "about the boundary, about the claim, about all of it. That brass marker proves what I should have known all along, that Hemlock's surveys were accurate and my documents were—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the admission. "They were fabricated, not by me directly, but by men I hired who told me what I wanted to hear." Cal said nothing, waiting. "I wanted this land," Blackwood continued. "I've wanted it for 30 years. My ranch has been struggling, and I convinced myself that if I could just get access to that section of the Clearwater, I could turn things around. When Hemlock died and left everything to a stranger, I saw an opportunity. I thought I could pressure you into selling, or at least into giving up part of the land through a legal challenge." "You sabotaged our fences," Cal said quietly. "You sent men to cause damage." Blackwood's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I did, and that shames me more than the legal fight. I'm not a man who does such things, or at least I didn't used to be. Desperation makes you compromise your principles in ways you never imagined." Cal thought about his own years of drifting, about the compromises he'd made, the times he'd taken the easy path instead of the right one. He understood desperation, understood how it could erode the foundations of who you thought you were. "Why are you telling me this?" Cal asked. "Because I'm 62 years old, and I've spent the past 3 days thinking about what kind of man I want to be for whatever time I have left." Blackwood looked out over the valley, at the land they'd fought over. "I built my ranch 40 years ago, worked hard, made it successful, raised cattle, and made a decent life. But somewhere along the way, I started measuring my worth by how much I owned instead of by what kind of man I was. When things got hard, I forgot everything that mattered." He turned back to Cal. "You're a better man than I am, Miller. The way you handled this situation, the way you earned the respect of your men, the way you fought for what Hemlock gave you, that's the kind of man I used to be. That's the kind of man I want to be again." Cal considered this, thinking about grace and redemption, about second chances and the strange ways they came to people. "What do you want from me?" "Blackwood?" "Nothing," Blackwood said. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I'm here to apologize and to tell you that if you ever need a neighbor's help, you'll have it. No strings, no expectations, just one rancher to another." He extended his hand, and Cal looked at it for a long moment. He thought about Hemlock and David, about fathers and sons, and the ways that pain could either poison you or push you towards something better. He thought about his own failures and the grace that had been extended to him through an old rancher's will. Cal took Blackwood's hand and shook it firmly. "Apology accepted. And the same goes for you if you need help. The double bar will be there." Something eased in Blackwood's expression, a tension he'd been carrying loosening slightly. "Thank you. That's more than I deserve." "Maybe," Cal said, "but I've been given more than I deserve, too. Seems like that's how grace works. It's never about deserving." Blackwood mounted his horse and looked down at Cal. "Hemlock chose well. I hope you know that. I'm learning, Cal replied. After Blackwood rode away, Cal stood alone for a while, processing what had just happened. The fight was truly over now, not just legally but personally. There would be no more challenges, no more sabotage, no more threats to what he was building. The ranch was secure, and more than that, he'd gained something he hadn't expected, a neighbor who understood both failure and the possibility of redemption. Riley rode back, his expression questioning. "Everything all right?" "Better than all right," Cal said, swinging back into his saddle. "Come on, we've got fence to check and a roundup to plan. Life goes on." They rode together across the land that was now indisputably Cal's, under a sky so blue it seemed endless, and Cal felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. He felt like he was finally home. September arrived with the first hints of autumn cooler mornings, leaves beginning to turn on the cottonwoods along the river, the cattle growing their winter coats. The spring roundup had been successful, the summer had been kind with good rain and mild temperatures, and the Double Bar Ranch was thriving under Cal's stewardship. He'd learned the rhythms of the land, the cycles of work, the 100 small decisions that made the difference between a ranch that merely survived and one that prospered. But more than the ranch had changed, Cal himself was different. The man who'd ridden up to the gate 6 months ago with nothing but a horse and the dust on his boots had been transformed by responsibility, by purpose, by the daily work of building something that would last. He moved with confidence now, spoke with authority earned through action, and carried himself like a man who knew his place in the world. On a bright morning in mid-September, Cal stood on the porch of the main house and pulled out his father's old pocket watch. The hands still showed 3:30, frozen in time as they had been for years. But today, that was going to change. He'd taken the watch into Helena 2 weeks earlier to have it repaired by a jeweler there, and just yesterday he'd picked it up, now working perfectly after decades of silence. He opened the case and watched the second hand sweep around the face, marking time's passage with quiet precision. The sound of wheels on the drive drew his attention, and Cal's heart began to beat faster. A coach was approaching, dust rising behind it in the morning sun. Dutch had gone to town to meet the train and bring Emma and her family back to the ranch, and now they were here. Cal walked down the porch steps and stood in the yard, suddenly aware of how much was riding on this moment. Would Emma see in him the father she'd lost, or just a stranger who shared her blood? Would her children accept him, or view him with the wariness that children often showed toward unfamiliar elders? The coach pulled to a stop, and Dutch climbed down from the driver's seat. The door opened, and a woman stepped out. Emma. She was in her mid-30s now, with Sarah's dark hair and eyes, but something in her bearing that Cal recognized as his own, a quiet steadiness that came from facing life's challenges head-on. Their eyes met across the yard, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then Emma smiled, and it transformed her face, made her look like the 6-year-old girl he remembered. "Hello, Father." "Hello, Emma." His voice was rough with emotion. "Welcome home." 3 children tumbled out of the coach, behind her 2 girls and a boy, ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 12. They looked at Cal with open curiosity, these grandchildren he'd never met, and he felt overwhelmed by the gift of their presence. Emma crossed the yard to him, and they stood facing each other for a heartbeat before she stepped forward and embraced him. Cal wrapped his arms around his daughter and felt 20 years of regret and loss begin to heal in that simple gesture. "I've missed you," Emma said quietly. "I've missed having a father." "I'm here now," Cal replied, "and I'm not leaving again." The children approached more slowly, shy but interested. Emma introduced them: Margaret, named after her grandmother, Sarah's mother; David, named after someone Emma didn't explain, but Cal understood with sudden, deep recognition; and little Catherine, who announced she was 5.5 and very interested in horses. Cal knelt to be at their level. "I'm your grandfather. I know we're strangers right now, but I hope we'll have time to change that. This ranch has been here for 40 years, and it'll be here long after I'm gone. It's your legacy as much as mine." David, who was 10, looked at the sprawling ranch with wide eyes. "All of this is yours?" "It's ours," Cal corrected gently. "Family isn't just about blood. It's about the stories we share and the future we build together." Over the following days, Cal showed them the ranch, the cattle and horses, the river and the mountains, the land that Hemlock had built, and Cal was now stewarding. He watched his grandchildren's faces as they discovered the wide-open spaces, the simple pleasures of ranch life, the satisfaction of work done with your hands. Emma told him about her life in Boston, about her husband John, who was a good man and a good father, about the choices she'd made and the life she'd built. They talked about Sarah, who had remarried years ago and found happiness, who had never spoken ill of Cal to Emma, despite having every right to. They talked about the past with honesty and the future with hope. One evening, as the sun was setting and painting the valley in gold and crimson, Cal and Emma sat on the porch while the children played in the yard under Dutch's watchful eye. Cal pulled out his father's watch, now working perfectly, and showed it to Emma. "Your grandfather gave me this when I was 16, he said. "He told me that time was all any of us really had, and we should spend it wisely. I didn't understand what he meant back then. I thought I had all the time in the world." Emma took the watch and examined it carefully. "And now? Now I understand that time isn't about the hours on a clock. It's about the moments that matter, the choices we make, the people we help, and the people who help us. Your grandfather gave me this watch, and Silas Hemlock gave me this ranch, but what they really gave me was the chance to use my time wisely, to build something, to be someone worth knowing." He looked out at the land that had become his home, at the grandchildren playing in the yard, at his daughter sitting beside him. "I wasted a lot of years, Emma. I can't get them back, but I can make sure the years ahead count for something." Emma handed the watch back to him. "They already do, Father. You're here. That's what matters." As darkness fell and the stars emerged one by one, Cal Miller sat on the porch of the ranch that had saved him, surrounded by family he thought he'd lost forever, and felt the pieces of his life finally coming together. He'd been a drifter who owned nothing, and through grace and chance, and one afternoon's work digging a calf from the mud, he'd become a man with everything that mattered. The watch in his pocket ticked steadily, marking time's passage. But Cal wasn't worried about time anymore. He was home, and he had work to do, and people who counted on him, and a legacy to build. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.